All right, guys, what's going on? We are going to talk a little bit about flipping this morning. And more specifically, we're going to try and address and answer one of the most commonly asked questions I get from you guys, whether it's out on the water on our guided trip or people messaging me or DMing me or just leaving comments in my pictures or videos asking, when do I pick up or how do I decide whether to pick up, or what I should say, what do I look for, which differentiates whether I pick up a big flipping jig like I'm holding here in my hand versus your standard flipping Texas rig with a bare plastic like a beaver, a creature, or a crawl style bait on it. I'm going to go over that with you guys real quick, as simple as I can. I'm going to try and keep it, like I said, as simplistic as I can, because that's the way I like to fish. Keep in mind, this is what works for me. This is what I look for and I seek out on the water. There's a lot of other anglers that are going to look for different things, that maybe look at it differently, entirely differently, that may have more experience and more success than me out here on Lake Okeechobee or just in South Florida in general. And that's fine. That's what's so cool about fishing, is that there's no right or wrong way. So you can listen to this and take from what you want from it, but do what you have confidence in. But this is just what works for me. So I've already tried to film this video twice, and I keep repeating myself and going off on tangents. So I'm going to try and, like I said, we're going to talk about the beaver style bait, when I flip it, when I don't, or when, and when I flip the jig, and try to just keep it categorized like that. So first off, right off the bat, I'll tell you guys, if I'm trying to flip any type of thick matted cover, something that requires an 1.25 ounces, 1.5 ounces, or 2 ounces to get through, 100% of the time, I'm going to flip the plastic. There are big punching jigs out on the market. My experience, my tip to you, don't waste your time with them. It's a lot of frustration. You're not fishing very efficiently. There's a lot of appendages and things to snag that mat, to either A, hinder its fall of going through, or B, even as it's sinking, it might catch leaf material or slime or gunk either on the exposed hook, on your big weed guard, or it might just catch and prevent this, on the skirt, and prevent this bait from free falling like you need it to be efficient in the mats. 100% of the time, I'm going to flip this when it comes to using a heavyweight. All right. Now that that's out of the way, we're going to talk about, what we're mainly talking about here today is pitching. Little reed, clumps, grass lines, sparse cover, things like that. So what I'm going to tell you right off the bat is 365 days out of the year, I have a light Texas flipping rig rigged up. Now, this is an 1.5 ounce tungsten, but for the sake of the video, let's pretend this is a 3/4 ounce weight. I have a 3/4 ounce Texas rig rigged up on a flipping rod all year long, every time I hit the water. You guys know that. You guys have seen it, mainly because it works all year long. It's going to get you bites when it's cold. It's going to get you bites when it's 90 degrees, when they're spawning, when they're just feeding. This is your most commonly used flipping rig out here on Lake Okeechobee. And when I'm flipping that 3/4 ounce around, I'd say 95% of the time, I'm going to have a beaver style bait on there like this, whether it's a D-bomb, an innovation beaver, a gambler ugly otter, something somewhat bigger, wider profiled. And it's, in that case, I don't know what it's trying to imitate. I think it imitates a lot of things. I think it imitates a small brim, a yearling bluegill. I think it imitates some kind of water bug. I think there's a lot of times they don't know what the hell it is, so they eat it. And the same thing kind of goes for the jig as well. But this is, so especially now, I'll tell you this also, from the months of, I'd say, October to early March, I don't even have a jig tied on. And we'll get into why here in a bit. But this is always on my deck from January to December, okay, all the way through. I'm going to flip this in and around thick Kissimmee grass, okay? If I'm flipping around maybe the outside edge, and I've run into some stretches of Kissimmee grass that are very thick and woven tight together, this is going to fall through that grass, especially if I'm trying to flip into the grass. If I'm flipping to the edge, obviously I can get by with a jig, but I can get by with this also. But it can also fall, it'll fall a lot more efficiently through the thick stuff. There's no appendages or anything for it to get caught on. And what's good about that is you can get in a rhythm. You can flip the outside, let it free fall, reel it in. The next flip, you can flip it 1.5 feet back into the grass, as opposed to picking up a jig, going down the outside, flipping it a little bit, putting it down, picking up your beaver style bait, trying to pick it apart. This is kind of a one-stop shop with that. Also, this time of year, which makes this great also, is just having this tied on and not worrying about the jig. We have a lot of the water's typically at a higher pool this time of year. This is typically our windy season, or most of our heavy winds are going to come here in the wintertime, and we have a lot more people on the lake. Now, what does that all matter? Why does that matter? High water means the wind's going to affect a lot of the backwater areas a lot more than it would if the lake was low. If it's blowing 30 mile an hour in the backwater areas or the marshes where we're fishing are only 1.5 feet deep, you might just get a light chop on the water. Whereas now when they're 3 or 4 feet deep, you might get white caps back there, which is going to move on top. So keep that in mind, on top of more boats. A lot of people are out here fishing. It's beautiful weather. That means more trolling motors in the water, chopping up a lot of eelgrass, hydrilla, peppergrass, dollar pads, you name it. So what I mean by that is you're going through, you're chopping, basically cutting the grass, it's floating to the top, and you get these things called chop grass mats. The heavy winds are going to push and move all that chop grass and compile it into these little mats, about the size of this table a lot of times, that are going to fixate in isolated cover, like round reed clumps, cattail clumps, little clumps of tall Kissimmee pads, like we call them, or even fixate on the edge of dollar pad fields. Now, what's cool about them is they're typically really small pieces of grass that have been caught up. So they're not really tight, which means they're very easy to fall and pitch through. You don't need 1.5 ounce weight to get through it. Your 3/4 ounce weight will typically fall through them fine. And a lot of times here in the winter, those are the reeds that you want to target. I do really well flipping chopped grass mats that are fixated into isolated cover this time of year. Flipping a jig, like I said, through anything that you have to go through is a pain. So that's another reason why I like having this, on 365. I typically always flip this because you could be flipping it to a bare open clump of reeds and come right to the next clump that might have this chopped grass in it. And this is going to go through it with ease. Also, even though right now it's 88 degrees and hot and the water temperature is warm, most of the time our water is on the cooler end or the cold end, obviously because we're in the wintertime, which means our fish, Florida bass, are going to be foraging or targeting smaller forage. You're not really going to often find, big fish up looking for giant hand-sized bluegill up shallow in the winter months, mainly because the bluegill aren't spawning, but just because that water temperature is on the lower end, and those fish are just looking to feed on smaller baits, such as shad, shiners, or yearling bluegill, which this does a very good job imitating. So I have a lot of confidence just strictly flipping this guy here. Now, if you had to pick one, if you said, man, I only have one flipping rod, I would always just go with the plastic. I've caught many a giant fish out here on the plastic. A lot of times you're going to get more bites on the plastic. And you could flip it where you flip the jig and where you can flip it where you cannot, or where it's not efficient to flip the jig, which is great. Like I said, you could flip that anywhere, anytime, and you're good. The times where I'm going to pick up the jig really come into late March, April, May, June, July, August through September. September is a lot of times when I start to put it down. And it's when our water temperatures start to rise. We get into spring/summertime, starts getting awfully hot. Our water levels are falling, and we get these big waves of big brim, big spawning size bluegill that make their way up to the shallows and start bedding. So essentially they're sitting ducks. I mean, they're big baits, they're big forage, they're a big meal for these big fish, and they're stuck in one area. So you'll get these big bass that just kind of patrol these areas where these bluegill are spawning, and that's what they're seeking after. Keep in mind, a bass is an opportunistic feeder. So a lot of times, if this lands in front of them, just a smaller plastic, they're going to eat that as well. But what's nice about the jig is it gives off that big profile. Okay, so it's already a bigger meal, a bigger morsel than this guy is. It looks a little bit meaner, I guess, and I think it does a really good job at resembling the profile of those big bluegill they're up there targeting. The other benefit to a jig is when you land them or when you hook them, for the most part, they are not coming off. You got to remember, when you set the hook on a beaver style bait, when you swing, it's the blink of an eye how fast all that happens. A bass's mouth is only about, at the end of the day, this deep. So half of that pull forward is that hook still trying to penetrate through the plastic. And by the time it gets out into the fish's mouth, a lot of times you tend to lip hook them a lot more, which is easier for them to jump and use that weight to their advantage to throw the hook. It's more hook shank sticking out of their mouth to catch on grass and reeds. How often have you guys had it where you set the hook and the fish starts mowing the grass down, the reeds cut, slide down your line, get into the shank of the hook, get between the fish's mouth and the gap of the hook, and start building up in there, 2, 3, 4 reed strands, and it'll actually de-hook your fish. Whereas with the jig, when they get it, it's an exposed hook, especially now with these double weed guard, the jigs, the hook doesn't have to penetrate the weed guard. It's just impact onto that fish's mouth. And a lot of times you'll hook them in the crunchers with the jig. So now that fish is swimming with its mouth open and there's no hook shank or anything for that jig to catch on. You can boat swing 9-pounders on it and they don't come off. Granted, you're flipping the right jig with a good sturdy hook in it. So you're going to lose a lot less fish. And a lot of times, maybe, a big fish is lazy a lot of times. So if they're going to go after a bait, a lot of times I feel like they want it to be worth it and make sense. So if this thing falls and they can just eat one big brim for the day as opposed to trying to chase down 3 or 4 little ones, I feel like this will get you a couple of extra big bites. That last big tournament that me and Breezy won, I weighed in pretty much all of them on this jig. And that was the perfect scenario. We had brim up shallow, seeking out, they weren't seeking out. They were actually on beds, and we could physically see the bass just patrolling around. So this just did a really good job at imitating that. And what was funny was I would pick up the plastic and go down the line and not get bit. And I would come back down it flipping this, and I would literally catch 10 to 12-inch fish on this big jig. Just because that was the forage that was around them, that was the kind of mode they were in, and that's what they were keyed in on. Whereas if we would have been on the outside edge and maybe they were eating smaller brim or maybe even keyed in on shad, but the best way to fish the area that the fish are in was to pitch or flip, the plastic might get bit more just because it's a smaller forage and that's what they were keyed in on. Another time I will pick up this jig, which is kind of the oddball scenario, which we could run into around now, is if I'm fishing an area where I know there's fish spawning, we're blind flipping beds, and maybe I'm in a pressured area where a lot of people are flipping smaller beaver or cross style baits. People are flipping Senkos around. It hit me one day that, a Senko, well, Gary Yamamoto based it off of a pen. So here's your Senko. If this lays on a bed, I feel like a lot of times those big smart fish may have A, seen a lot of Senkos before, or B, just look at that and say, that's not really a threat to my young, to my eggs. I'm not really sure what it is. Some kind of a worm, and they may let it just kind of ease on by and you pull it off the bed. Maybe the male will hit it first, but the females won't really engage on it. Whereas if this big scary thing lands on that bed, it looks a lot more intimidating and a lot just, it's a lot bulkier. It's a bigger deal. And I feel like they might not want this anywhere around their bed. So if it's warm, the water's over 70 degrees. That's another thing I'll tell you. I'll flip the plastic in 45-degree water, but I don't pick the jig up until that water gets over 70. That's just a confidence thing for me. So a lot of guys out there maybe catch them on 60-degree water. I don't know. But for me, 70 degrees. But if it's 70 and I think that there's fish spawning and they're big fish, I will go to a jig, flip it to the isolated cover where I think that there's fish spawning, and just dead stick it there for 5 to 10 seconds. A lot of times then also I'll cover it with a scent, like the Strike Force stuff. The skirt does a really good job holding that scent. And I think a lot of times those big ones just, that thing is so big and ugly, they don't want it around their bed at all, and they're more prone to suck it in. I've had a couple events where I've fished behind people fishing spawning fish that maybe were catching the males off the beds on Senkos or smaller baits and moving on through, and I'd go behind them and pick females off with this. It's a very niche situation, but I have had it happen. And the other thing is, the biggest difference also is there's scenarios where the fast fall of a plastic is what's engaging those fish to strike, like on the edge, like a grass line or something. That fast fall of that 3/4 ounce weight on that plastic is what's triggering those fish to strike. Keep in mind, a 1 ounce jig is not going to fall as fast as a 1/2 ounce Texas rig, just because that skirt and weed guard and everything slow the fall down. So it's more or less, if I'm looking to get a fish to react to a bait, maybe fish that aren't actively feeding, like in those chopped grass mats, in those reeds that are more in there just to be secluded and sheltered, that fast fall is what makes them engage and strike. Whereas if I have fish that are actively feeding, like maybe on the shoal in the springtime, when all those fish are out there feeding on those bluegill that are on the outside edge also, they're seeking those big bluegill out, they're patrolling, they're hunting. Whereas this nice, it's still a quick, but a slower, gradual, natural fall of this jig, I think just, they can't stand it. It just looks like a brim swimming down, and they hammer it. Or there might be a big portion of them that don't know what this is, but they get, the only way that they can find out is to eat it. So 70 degrees, sparser cover, don't have to punch through anything. And, even thick Kissimmee grass. A lot of times I'll find thick Kissimmee grass that's just really wadded up. And if I'm having a hard time getting this jig to sink through it, don't get frustrated and be inefficient. Just pick up the plastic. 70-degree water. If I think I'm around big spawning fish that are highly pressured, I'll pick this up. And fish that are in brim mode, bluegill mode. If you're around bass, if you are actively seeing brim, either on the bed or just lots of numbers of big bluegill around, bulk it up. Like I said, you will catch 1 pound bass on this big jig. Don't think little ones won't eat it. And there are times where the jig will totally outperform the plastic, like I said. So keep these in your box, play with them, play with the jig. Like I said, though, I have a Texas 3/4 ounce rig, or maybe a couple of them. Sometimes I have 1 1/4 ounce rigged in my boat 365 days out of the year. But once we get into spring and summer, I always have a jig tied on one of my rods as well. I flipped both of these presentations on the exact same setup. That 711 Arc Essence heavy action rod, 65-pound test performance, Suffix performance braid, and anywhere from a 7-to-1 to a 7.5-to-1 gear ratio reel. You want it quick that you can be efficient, get it in and get it out, but you don't want it too quick to where you can't turn the handle when you hook a big one. And that's it. So hopefully that helped you guys out. That's what I look for. I can get as in-depth as you want on this, but I'd be talking for 3 hours. But flipping is my favorite way to catch them. The jig is really my favorite way to catch them, but at the end of the day, you got to be efficient. You got to do what works. And this time of year, I feel like the plastic outperforms the jig in most cases. But I'm not going to be picky. Most of my big ones I've caught on this lake have come on that bad boy right there. So keep that in mind. If you guys want to book a trip, let me know. My contact information is below. I do have a few available dates left in December. But I appreciate you guys watching, and I look forward to the next one. I'll see you guys out there.